This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sander Gilman. He is a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and sciences, as well as a professor of psychiatry here at Emory University. Dr. Gilman is a prolific scholar, having authored and edited over 80 volumes, including the Third Reich source book, Jewish Self-Hatred, Anti-Semitism, and the Hidden Language of the Jews, The Jew's Body, and Smart Jews, Jews in Today's German Culture, the construction of the idea of the Jewish superior intelligence at the other end of the bell curve. He is the co-editor of the Johns Hopkins Jewish Studies series, editor of the University of Nebraska Press series, Jewish Writing in Contemporary World. And the title of his talk today is Aliens versus Predators, Jewish Cosmopolitans and Jewish Nomads. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning. Evidently, from the introduction, you realize I'm wearing my Jewish hat today. And I don't think that's unimportant. I'm completing a project on the history of the idea and experience of cosmopolitanism. And the thesis of this book is that looking at Central European, specifically German notions of rootedness and unrootedness, of mobility and fixity, the litmus test, certainly since the Enlightenment, has been the Jews. When I speak of the Jews, I'm speaking of a dynamic stereotype that creates a single category out of what are contradictory religious, historical, ethnic, racial, and cultural categories. There are indeed individual Jews who may or may not define themselves using single or multiple category, but the Jews is never an uncontested concept. Jewish cosmopolitanism, or Jewish nomadism, may be a term, by the way, of praise or of opprobrium. Indeed, the core of any discussion of the fantasies about any type of unitary definition of Jewish cosmopolitanism hangs on the very meaning associated with its permanence or its mutability within the new nation state. And that's why, by the way, Central Europe, what we can euphemistically in the 18th century call Germany, is of interest to me. Because Germany constitutes its imaginary. Lessing does this. By defining it in terms of what it is not. It is an imagined community. It is not a real nation state. And my old friend Benedict Anderson, and one always quotes Anderson in this context, suggests that an imagined political community, and imagined is both inherently limited and sovereign, because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. This is even more the case in the multiple contradictory world of Central and Western Europe. Now, when I started this project, I was interested in this notion of mobility and the notion of who are the nomads. And so immediately, certainly for me, when I think of Central Europe, because I live in the beginning of the 21st century, it is not necessarily the Jews, but the Gypsies, the Sinti and Roma. And one of the things that is so fascinating is that in this mindset of early discussions of cosmopolitanism, Jews are Gypsies, or perhaps better, Gypsies are Jews. Wagenseil in 1705 notes that the first gypsies, the term Zigeuner is used obviously, were indeed Jews who fled into forests after having been accused in the 14th century of whale poisoning. Claiming they had come from Egypt, there's a nice little biblical pun there. There they cheated the peasants in the forest by claiming to do wondrous cures and prevent fires. Eventually, these Zigeuner Jews returned to the cities and became sedentary, mobility versus being sedentary, and declared they were Jews. But thieves and beggars had joined them, and they continued their nomadic ways. For proof, Weigenseil claims that the gypsies were unknown before the 14th century, and that the language of today's gypsies, at least in 1705, is full of Hebrew words, and that their amulets use Kabbalistic formulas. Now, what's really important in the course of the 18th century is that this notion of fixity, this notion of mobility, becomes intimately connected with one other quality. And it is a quality which is historically part of the stereotype of the Jews, and that has to do with notions of capital. We can easily talk about the meanings of usury in the Middle Ages and how it is used to define not only the image of the Jews, but actually the social role of the Jews. Notions of usury in the course of the 18th century become transmuted into notions of capital. And that's a really important shift, which is almost always ignored. Yes, it has historical roots, but the notion of capital becomes really central to understanding the notions of rootedness and rootlessness, especially in regard to the Jews. In the Encyclopédie, a notion of the cosmopolitan, and this goes back to Fénelon earlier in the 18th century, is defined as a man of no fixed abode, or a man who is nowhere a stranger. And that's a really important notion, because the notion of cosmopolitanism is both, as I've said at the beginning, both a positive and a negative. But it's also the case in the Enlightenment, certainly in the Encyclopédie, that when de Jocard begins to think about the Jews, he thinks about them in terms of their historical role within capital. So notions of mobility, the Jew usury becomes capital. These ordinances and other similar ones he writes in the essay on the Jews, to them most rightly together, fortify them in their belief, separate them from other human beings, and leave them for their substance only commerce, a profession long disdained by the majority of the peoples of Europe. Kings who could not go through the pockets of their subjects tortured the Jews, whom they did not regard as citizens. And what is really important for the Enlightenment is the imagined, I'm going to use the word imagined a lot in this talk, the imagined transformation now of the Jews into agents of capital, but also then as citizens. And in the German-speaking world, the most interesting figure in this, of course, is Herder. In the Ideas for Philosophy of the History of Mankind, Herder sees the Jews, and this is, again, often overlooked, as one of these many little wandering hordes. Herder's a theologian, right? He's a theologian in the Old Testament. And he then discusses what these wandering hordes, these nomads, innovated. And what they innovated, right, were trade by weight and measure, capitalism. Herder's notion is that the Jews are rooted and, of course, cosmopolitan simultaneously. The Jew of Moses are properly of Palestine. Outside of Palestine, there can be no Jew, he writes. And yet a time will come when no person in Europe will inquire whether a man be a Jew or a Christian. Jews will live according to European laws and contribute to the state. Fixed. You'll see that Herder has problematic understandings, because he really thinks that fixity is a good thing, especially, by the way, when he thinks about the Germans, who do not exist, remember? Herder's Germans are a fiction, are an imagined community, and they are not the Jews. Had the Jews stayed in the land of their fathers and in the midst of other nations, remain as they were, that is, as Jews, and even when mixed with other people, they may be distinguished for some generations downward. The more secluded they lived, nay, frequently, the more they were oppressed, the more their character was confirmed, fixity. But there are, of course, those people who have migrated at least once sooner or later to a greater distance or less, like all other people, Herder says. In other words, he says, yes, there's fixity, but we all are mobile. And yet he is quite comfortable quoting from Kant and from Kant's lectures on practical philosophy about the nature of what this difference of the fixed and yet mobile, the mobile yet fixed Jew is. Every coward is a liar. Jews, for example, not only in business, but also in common life. Now, the person who answers Herder and Herder's notions of mobility and fixity is, of course, Kant. And all of you who know about the debates about cosmopolitanism, certainly since the beginning of the 21st century, know that all of them begin with Kant and with the idea of a universal history with a cosmopolitan purpose of 1784. He dismisses Herder's romantic speculations on the very nature of man, and further, in the essay on perpetual peace, 1795, states that the use of the right to the earth's surface, which belongs to the human race in common, would finally bring the human race ever closer to a cosmopolitan constitution. That is, mobility, right? Mobility is one of the signs of enlightenment, unless you're the community of the Jews. Because for Jews, in Kant's anthropology, they are, as Herder had evoked, the Palestinians living among us. They have earned a not unfounded reputation for being cheaters because of their spirit of usury since their exile. Certainly it seems strange to conceive of a nation of cheaters, but it is just as odd to think of a nation of merchants, right? And it's rather an interesting notion that for Kant, the notion of cosmopolitanism, of mobility, is wonderful and positive until you connect it to capital. And the moment you connect it to capital, you define the Jew. And this is part and parcel of this discourse about cosmopolitanism, which is very German. Indeed, the first volley in modern racial anti-Semitism in Germany is a book written by Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Grothenauer in 1803 under the pseudonym The Voice of a Cosmopolitan. The Jews in general, the Jews everywhere and nowhere, are nomads from the Orient. He's answering, of course, Dohm's 1781 on the civil improvement of the Jews. Grothenauer's voice, according to Grothenauer, is that of the true cosmopolitan, not of Jewish mendicants and merchants such as Moses Mendelssohn, Lessing's model Jew, who extort, and this is Grothenauer, their claims of their rights as citizens to inflict damaging interest on innocent Christians. This is pure Kant, of course. They are not cosmopolitan, according to Grothenauer. In the end, they are merely Jews, using this claim, the claim of mobility and cosmopolitanism, for their own pernicious ends. And this becomes kind of a trope in the 19th century. Wilhelm Rabe's Hungerpastor of 1864 has this extraordinary moment when one of the Jewish characters points out that being German, right, being rooted, being national, not being a nomad, is a garment easily discarded. I have the right to be a German, he says, when I so desire it, and the right to give up this honor at any given moment. We Jews are indeed the true cosmopolitans, Weltbürger, by the grace of God, or if you will, by God's ungraciousness. Now, we're getting again into a period of German intellectual history, where this question of mobility, the question of rootedness, becomes the defining question of what is a German and what is a Jew. But it also becomes part and parcel of this discussion about Kapital. And Marx, in 1877, notes that it is indeed the nomad races, he writes, are the first to develop the money form, because all their worldly goods consist of movable objects and are therefore directly alienable, and because their mode of life, by continually bringing them into contact with foreign communities, solicits the exchange of products. That is, capitalism for Marx is indeed the result of being mobile, of being the nomad. Now, it is no surprise, because we are now at the end of the middle of the 19th century, that this discussion of mobility and capital, of mobility as a positive or a negative definer, becomes part and parcel of proto-Zionism and of Zionism itself. George Moses quite correctly said, and here I will follow him, that when one starts to look at the development of nationalistic movements in the 19th century, right? Among them, by the way, German nationalism. Remember, Germany is a very, very, very late state, right? German nationalism, Zionism, fascism, and communism. Moses takes these examples. They have to do with constituting what is not only a national state, but what defines a member of that national state. And as early as the 1860s, the notion that the Jews are inherently, biologically, and I really want to stress this, essentially cosmopolitan, becomes part and parcel of a way that European Jews begin, following Kant, to think about cosmopolitanism as becoming universal citizens, but also, because remember Kant has both of these meanings, citizens of the national state. Kant doesn't see these as problematic. The Jewish race, this is 1860, alone has the capacity to dwell in every portion of the earth, to reproduce and to develop without abandoning its racial specificity, but also in healthier circumstances than the indigenous population. One can see this in the promise of God that Israel will spread to the limits of the world. Now, early Zionists, and one always quotes Leo Pinsker in 1882 in Auto-Emancipation, early Zionism takes this notion that this Jew is a nomad not at all as a positive, but rather as a fault. The statelessness of the Jew in the age of nationalism damns him, according to Pinsker, to be a nomad. For the Jews produce in accordance with its nature vagrant nomads, so long as it cannot give a satisfactory account of whence it comes and whence it goes, so long as the Jews themselves prefer not to speak in Aryan society of their Semitic descent, their nomadic descent, and prefer not to be reminded of it, they will be Jew peddlers, because they refuse, and Pinsker's wonderful, he turns this right on its head, to acknowledge their own rootedness in the desert as true nomads. Right? The Jews have to say, we're Semitic, we belong in the desert, we are rooted in the desert. The Jew is a true cosmopolitan. Rabbi Karl Köhler says in Boston, lecturing, of course, preaching, of course, in German, is a true cosmopolitan, but only disgusting and uncomfortable to those authorities who wish to rule and dominate with blood and iron, who destroy freedom and support bigoted hypocrisy, and wish to corrupt eternal human rights. Bismarck, German nationalism, right? We, Reformed Jews in Boston, are the true cosmopolitans. Herzl is uncomfortable with both. Michael Stanislavski, in a wonderful book, which is really about the whole debate within Zionism of the mobility or rootedness of the Jews, positive and negative. Notice the Jews are both universalist cosmopolitanism as well as essentially Jewish, because being Jewish as a national identity was de facto claiming universal values. Have your cake and eat it too, right? Herzl writes that it might further be said that we ought not to create new distinctions between people. We ought not to raise fresh barriers. We should rather make the old disappear, but men who think this way are amiable visionaries. In the idea of a native land will so flourish when the dust of their bones will have vanished tracelessly in the wind. Universal brotherhood is not even a beautiful dream. So much for cosmopolitanism. Antagonism is essential to men's greatest efforts. And the great irony, I always love ironies in these debates among intellectuals, is that he absolutely agrees with Fichte. Strangely, given the status of Cosmopolitan and his views of the Jews in the 18th century, Fichte completely agrees with Herzl when he states that every cosmopolitan, cosmopolite, is necessarily, given his limitations by the nation, a patriot, and each who in his nation is the strongest and most active patriot is also the most active Weltbürger, cosmopolitan. Now, early Zionism, unlike the proto-Zionism of Pinsker, really debates this question. I mean, Herzl kind of throws it open and says, you know, being Jewish means that you're universal, being universal means you're cosmopolitan, but it also means you have to have a national identity, because by definition, if you're Jewish, you belong now to a Jewish nation. Right? Franz Oppenheimer, the great German Zionist, writes in 1903, Zionists are now accused of being reactionary because we do not wish to proceed to an ideal that lays before us, but rather that we recede to an ideal in the past. Not universal cosmopolitanism, but national identity. The future does not lie in the emphasis on nationalism, not in that which divides people, but rather than on that which connects them. This is pure Herzl. Is the high ideal of a Weltbürgertum un-Zionist or indeed anti-Zionist? Today there spreads across the land a new culture that wishes to eradicate the difference between peoples. Today we, the Zionists, are the new Maccabees struggling against this idea of cosmopolitanism. This is highly contested, because at the same moment, of course, the Jews are being accused of being cosmopolitan, are being accused of being rootless. And Max Brod in Der Jude in 1916, and it's a wonderful quote, notes that one should not inject us, the Jews, with being a centrifugal force in society, and then marvel at the findings of nomadism and critical destruction in our corpse. We, Brod said, are only nomads because you, the German nationalists, say that we are. But the nomadic becomes, in part, one of these incredibly important defining moments for the early 20th century. Simmel, in The Philosophy of Money, which is a classic answer, of course, to Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which is, by the way, those of you who know anything about the debates within American history and in British history, the kind of underlying notion that Protestantism, right? Protestantism is the origins of modernity for good or for ill. Simmel notes that as a rule, nomadic peoples hold land in common property of the tribe, and assign it only for the use of individual families. This is anti-Marx. But livestock is always the private property of these families. As far as we know, the nomadic tribe has never been communistic with regard to cattle as property, even though they have this kind of notion of common property. Now, Zimmel, who has his own complex relationship both to his Jewish identity but also to the Jews of his own time, becomes part and parcel of a discussion which gets spun off of Weber, and most famously, of course, in Werner Sombert's answer to Weber, called The Jews and Modern Capitalism, 1911. Sombert writes of the restless, wandering Bedouins who were the Hebrews who established in this promised land an economic organization where the powerful and mighty among them, having acquired large tracts of land, instituted a sort of feudal society. Part of the produce of the land they took for themselves, either by the rent of in kind, by farming it out to tax collectors, or by the means of the credit nexus. And this is, of course, the critique now of the Jews and capital in the new German state. Weber doesn't leave this unanswered. He writes an entire book. It was supposed to be the first of a whole series of books on ancient Judaism. He publishes in 1920, 1921, his last great work. And he argues exactly against, defending himself, obviously, against such a view. He accepts that there's a narrative, not a historical, but a narrative succession of the three stages of the three patriarchs, from the nomad Abraham to the peasant Jacob. But he refutes the idea that the nature of Jewish usury stems from any biblical claims. The medieval and modern money and pawn usury of the Jews, the caricature in which this promise was fulfilled, was certainly not intended by holy promise. If a quality of the Jews, usury, capital, it is one no different from the cosmopolitan world of the ancient city with its myth of agrarian settlement. In other words, what he's saying basically is that the Jews are a city people who create a fantasy, right? A fantasy of a nomadic origin. Now that's perhaps the most rational statement about Jews and nomadism in this period. For the term nomad itself became part and parcel of anti-Semitic rhetoric at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. In other words, framing Sombart, framing Zimmel, framing Weber. The Jews are nasty nomads. Thus, we have the typical image of the private enterprise of the nomad that continues until today in the farm of the wandering merchants and dealers who crosses the land selling junk stocks and thus rob our peasants and return on the Sabbath with their plunder home to wife and children. It's not actually very far from Pinsker. The Jews violate all human laws as nomads. Even the highest law regarding the safety of the stranger is not recognized by these nomads. Thus, Jewish Yael murders Sisera after having been tempted into a tent and served milk. Trusting her, he goes to sleep. Then Yael drives a stake into his temple and mocks his mother when she comes to seek her son. This is not nice stuff. These are really nasty nomads. And they really are part and parcel of this notion now of the non-rooted Jew. Houston Stuart Chamberlain famously notes that of all the histories of the ancient world, there is none that is more convincing, none more easily to be realized than the wanderings of patriarch Abraham. It is a story of 4,000 years ago. It is a story of yesterday. It is a story of today. It is the history of a degenerate and flexible people, for any change in the manner of living is said to have a very bad effect on the high qualities of the genuine and purely Semitic nomads. If the Bedouin of the desert chooses a settled life, he, as a rule, unites to himself all the vices of the nomad and of the peasant. And this is the Jew manqué, lazy, deceitful, cruel, cowardly. He is rightly regarded by all nations as the scum of mankind. This becomes part and parcel of the way that intellectuals start to understand both the new national state, remember it's now second-generation Germans, but also the very risk that that state has. Spengler, 1918, noted that Germany was in the grasp of an inorganic, cosmopolitan masses which had to give way to a new, and it's a lovely phrase, agricultural intuitive spring, ruled by an organic structure of political existence. For Spengler, this is true of the Volk, that is this rootedness of the organic structure of political existence, of the Volk, because the Volk never wanders. They are fixed in time and space. The Jews for Spengler represent money and can only be overcome by blood, the inherent rootedness of the Volk. Now, this notion that the Jews, this is the end of the First World War, the Jews are nomads, nasty nomads, capital nomads, whose wandering is now present in Germany, is countered by one political argument in the 1920s, and that's Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. The Jew never possessed a state with definite territorial limits, and therefore never called a culture of his own. The conception arose that this was a people that should be ranked among the ranks of the nomads. The Jews aren't really nomads. This is a fallacy, Hitler says, as great as it is dangerous. The nomad does possess a definitely limited living space, only he does not cultivate it like a sedentary peasant, but lives from the yields of his herds with which he wanders about in his territories. So Hitler says, the nomads are good guys, all right? It's an earlier stage, right, of the development of capitalism. The Jews are not nomads. They, in point of fact, are simply unrooted. Now, while Hitler says this in 1925, the rhetoric of National Socialism disagrees with Mein Kampf. While, as you know, every married couple got a copy of Mein Kampf after 1934 as a present from the state, and Hitler, of course, got a royalty from selling those, I am convinced that most of those copies remained unopened. Few people actually read Mein Kampf, except maybe in the party schools. The notion that the Jews were nasty nomads becomes part and parcel of fascist rhetoric. Here, the psychoanalyst C.J. Jung, lecturing in Berlin in 1934, the Jew is something of a nomad, he says, has never yet created a cultural form of his own, and as far as we can see, never will, since all of his instincts and talents require a more or less civilized nation to act as a host for their development. The Aryan unconscious, he notes, has a higher potential than the Jewish. And this is part and parcel, then, of rhetoric to be found within the official party line. Alfred Rosenberg, the party theoretician, if one can use that word as loosely as possible, in an age post-Zizek, notes that Marx recognized the age of technology had descended upon the world and that this required an attended maturation of the social framework. He, along with his followers, an international swarm of Jewish orators and literati from the cosmopolitan centers of an increasingly racially degenerate cities, got together to formulate a set of social tenets for the despairing victims of an age who are so estranged from land and landscape, right? Bad nomads, as to have been stripped of the standards for judging this disastrous doctrine of doom. And Goebbels notes that Bolshevism, and the term, of course, is almost always Judeo-Bolshevism, is not merely anti-bourgeois, it is against human civilization itself. It is, in its final consequences, it signifies the destruction of all the commercial, social, political, and cultural achievements of Western Europe in favor of, and this is where this rhetoric becomes very interesting to me, of a deracinated and nomadic international cabal that has found its representation in Judaism. Right? These are now these shape-shifting individuals, nomads, cosmopolitans, rootless and yet rooted in cities, urban, not rural, nomads, but nasty nomads. In 1937, Heidegger, in a lecture, noted that a Slavic people would experience the essence of our German space certainly differently than we do. And then he goes on to note, Semitic nomads would probably not experience it at all. Because being rooted into a space means, in a sense, being one with that space. And the Slavs are rooted in their Slavic space. But the Jews, who are essentially nomads, not in Hitler's sense, right? They are nomads in the sense that they have no relationship to space whatsoever, cannot even register the very notion of being rooted. The question of the role of world Jewry is not a racial, Heidegger writes in the Black Notebooks, but rather a metaphysical one about the type of human specificity that is in all cases to be extrapolated as a world historical goal from the rootlessness of the becoming from being. This notion of rootlessness strikes me at the core of the discussions about cosmopolitanism and nomadism, about the constitution of this imagined community of the state, of the people, and then even more so of the human. The question of the role of world Jewry, he writes in 1941, is not a racial question, but the metaphysical question about the kind of humanity that without any restraints can take over the uprooting of all beings from being as its world historical task. And this is very much Rosenberg's notion. This is very much Goebbels' notion of the undermining force, the nomadic cosmopolitan force of the Jew. Karl Baumberg, in 1942, in a book called Jews Create World Politics, notes that with ice-cold diabolical calculation, they unleashed a new world war that they hoped would defeat the national authoritarian nations. After destroying these nations, the way would once again be open to establish Jewish domination of the remaining nations. The immutable and lunatic goal of world Jewry is and remains the domination of every nation on its own territory by firmly lodging itself in nations' organs and exercising complete control of their soul, their money, and all their goods. Capital. It remains part and parcel of Nazi rhetoric that the Jews infiltrate They are omnipresent. They are, in point of fact, the controlling mechanism now of the national state. At the start of the third year of the planetary war, Heidegger writes in September, perhaps, of 1941, common sense would like to calculate history and longs for a balance sheet. And he has this balance sheet, the ninth point of which is world Jewry, we just heard this quote, spurred on by the immigrants who have been let out of Germany, is intangible everywhere, and as much as it develops its power, never has to take part in warlike activities. This is the stab in the back theory. The Jews avoided service in World War I. They always manipulate, but they never serve. It wasn't true during World War I, certainly not true in the Second World War. Never has to take part in warlike activities, whereas the only thing left for us is to sacrifice the best blood of the best of our own people. And this is virtually a paraphrase, by the way, of the stab in the back thesis of 1919. And it's part and parcel of Nazi rhetoric. This island, Günter Gründel writes in 1934 about the Jahre der Überwindung, the year of revolution, this island of whining, fault-finding, bloodless intellectuals floating in a sea of swirling renewal and change is admittedly growing smaller by the month, far more seldom seen. Nevertheless, even if there are scarcely 100,000 of them left in Germany today, they are now all the more numerous in foreign countries, which for the new Germany is perhaps as pertinent. There they are in league with German outcasts and immigrants, the sacked, and thus remain vicious enemies. Right? They are out there. They are our perpetual enemy. Heidegger again. One of the most secret forms of the gigantic, and perhaps the oldest, is the tenacious skillfulness in calculating, hustling, and intermingling through which the worldlessness of Jewry is grounded. It's a wonderful phrase because, in point of fact, this notion of rootedness and rootlessness of the cosmopolitan and the nomad as ungrounded is part and parcel of this rhetoric. It is what defines the Jew as an imaginary as opposed to the German imaginary, of course. Engelbert Huber in 1933. Even though the spirit of egotism, self-aggrandizement, and ruthless greed had already become the driving force between economic activities by the time of the 1789 revolution as a result of the prevailing doctrine of Freemasonry, and to dismiss the Christian doctrine of the individual's inherent obligation to the common good as antiquated and backward, there were still certain internal reservations non-Jews had to overcome because they could adopt without any qualms the Jewish economic methods that fed into capitalism. So non-Jewish devotees of capitalism have always come in a few lengths behind their unscrupulous Jewish forerunners in the capitalist race. Now, capitalism for the Nazis, and remember that the economic underpinnings, right, of fascism, and I'll use Zev Sternhal's nice equivalent. He always says that totalitarianism plus capitalism is fascism. The underpinnings of the fascist state, of the Nazi state, is capital. It's central plan capitalism, but it is capitalism. But it is a German capitalism. It is not a Jewish capitalism. The rhetoric of the cosmopolitan versus the nomad, the rhetoric of being rooted or being unrooted, you would think vanishes after the Second World War. In point of fact, it remains in a complicated way present, and I would say present in ways that we even today wrestle with. In 1951, in Minima Moralia, Adorno writes that dwelling in the proper sense is now impossible. The traditional residence we grew up in have grown intolerable. The house is past. It is part of a morality not to be home in one's home, of being unrooted, now the life of the exile. And one of the things that is interesting is that after the Second World War, the modern nomad returns now. Adorno going from Los Angeles to Frankfurt. And in the German language writers, such as Alfred Anders in 1957, and Swiss writers like Max Frisch in 1961's Andorra, turned the actual experience of Jews into the Holocaust into the symbolic representation of what else? The cosmopolitan sacrificial victim. So after the Holocaust, both within German culture, and I would argue even within German Jewish intellectual culture, if we can use Adorno as a representative of this question of the meanings of rootedness as opposed to the meanings of mobility remains questioned, remains still debated. And modern Jewish historians have not escaped this. Jake Neusner, in Self-Fulfilling Prophecies, argues for a material understanding of diaspora, right? Involuntary exile of the Jews. For him, it is a model of wilderness and land, the dialectic between tent and house. We're back to nomadism and agriculture, wilderness and Canaan, wandering and settlement, diaspora and state. The Protestant theologian W.D. Davis has argued in The Territorial Dimension of Judaism that this dichotomy is well balanced in the Bible, that for every, quote, praising wilderness as the decisive factor in Judaism, there could be found a counterpart praise of the land of Zion, Zion. Galut, which is the voluntary dispersion of the Jews, right? The notion, Kantian notion of the cosmopolitan, is often understood as the experienced reality of being in exile, structured by the internalization of the textual notion of the diaspora. And here I think Weber is right. What is fascinating is that the city-state of Israel, the city-state of Judea, with their competing versions of Jewish history, create this illusion of the ideal nomad as opposed to the city dweller. This becomes part and parcel of a Jewish historical understanding of Galut. The Jew experiences the daily life of exile through the mirror of a biblical model of expulsion, whether it is the expulsion from the Garden of Eden or the freeing from Egypt, slavery in Egypt. Galut has formed a new Jewish self-understanding of exile. And that's certainly true with thinkers, German thinkers, Jewish thinkers after World War II. Now, such a history of cosmopolitanism and nomadism points toward the ambivalence of these very concepts when applied in our day to specific categories, whether the Jew, the asylum seeker, the migrant, the illegal, the undocumented. When used, they signal either a permanent state of rootlessness or the potential for a new groundedness. And each can be understood as either positive or negative, and sometimes both simultaneously. These labels come to be internalized, and this is why they're important. They're just not stereotypes and fantasies, but they come to be internalized by members of these groups. This seems to be an especially complex in the case of cultural producers who understand themselves as Jewish. I'm thinking of people like Zimmel. But it is also true in the diasporic situation, whether it is in British, American, or Palestinian exile, under and following the Nazi domination of the nation states of Central Europe. This remains true, by the way, in a contemporary Israel, formed out of the ideological debates about Zionism as anti-cosmopolitanism, as well as in the case of the Jews in the diaspora today, which continues to ask how rooted Jews are or can be in the modern national state. And that modern national state, by the way, also today, in a post-Zionist moment, includes Israel. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to entertain questions, objections, long, boring intellectual interludes in which Zizek is quoted at me.
Very short question. Can you elaborate on the distinction between racial and metaphysical anti-Semitism?
Between racial and metaphysical anti-Semitism. Well, you know, one of the things that one does, I'll wear my hat now as a historian of medicine, is one gets interesting in the history of classification. All right? And so, sure, I can give you an hour lecture on the classifications of anti-Semitism as opposed to Judeophobia, as opposed to anti-Judaism, which is the title of the most recent history of anti-Semitism. I could give you enormously complicated classifications. They're interesting, but they're interesting only as classifications. They're absolutely useless in understanding the phenomenon. The phenomenon has to be understood historically in the moment. So the answer is, you want me to give you an answer in 1927, I'll give you an answer in 1927. I can give you an answer in 1865. But you want me to give you a classification distinction.
Just in reference to Heidegger, because Heidegger makes this distinction too.
That's Heidegger's problem, not mine. All right? In other words, the answer is you can do it. You can absolutely do it because in the German intellectual world, starting, by the way, well before 1933, there are debates. Frank is one of the big people involved with it, in talking about what is it about the Jews and about our relationship to the Jews that we can theorize. There are many, many books on this topic, right? And they're interesting as a debate within the Nazi Party, the debate, for example, between Goebbels and Rosenberg. Right? But if you're asking me whether or not they're useful distinctions transhistorically, they're not. But they're very interesting discussions to take a look at within the Third Reich, and specifically among, and I use the word, by the way, when I say Third Reich and intellectual, you do understand that those are ironic terms, right? I mean, you do understand this. I mean, you cannot put the word intellectual and the Third Reich in the same sentence without understanding that this undermines the very idea of questioning. So the answer is, I'm happy to make the distinction that existed in the time, but it's only interesting because there is this debate. So, for example, the notion of biological anti-Semitism postulates the notion of blood. But the notion of metaphysical anti-Semitism takes blood as metaphor. Is there a difference between the two? Yeah, I guess if you want to argue that one is rooted in a biological explanation, one a philosophical one, but the metaphors are the same.
You've addressed it in part, but just a follow-up on that question. Doesn't Heidegger do us a favor, in a sense, when he turns the question of world Jewry into a metaphysical question concerning uprooting? Because what would it mean to annihilate the Jews if Jew is not a racial category? And it can't be Rosenberg and Goebbels' notion, as you claimed it was, if their notion is racial. Isn't it precisely because Jew is not a racial category in Heidegger that we're warranted, or might be warranted, in substituting a different term for Jewry, such as civil society, Worldmachenschaft, etc.?
Yeah,
in other words, doesn't actually... If you say the distinctions between philosophical and racial, a law rests on the distinction, it seems.
But if you want to get to the debates in the 20th century about that notion, you start with Otto Weininger. Because Otto Weininger says being Jewish has nothing to do with being a Jew. He says it has to do with a mindset, right? And he says, I, a Jew, have nothing Jewish about me whatsoever, right? But Wagner is a Jew, Weininger says. Okay? So the answer is that a helpful category? Yeah, it is, by the way, for Wittgenstein, who is Jewish and who is the biggest advocate within philosophy of Weininger in the 1920s and 30s. Because it gets him out of that bind of a biological self-definition, which puts him in a situation of being inferior. Okay? Is it interesting that then Heidegger then picks this argument up, which is an argument already of the first decade of the 20th century? Yeah, but it says, as I've said over and over again, it says how unoriginal Heidegger is as a thinker. Right?
Thank you, Sander. I'd like to pull together...
Could you move the mic a little bit closer?
Thank you, Sander.
Thank you.
I'd like to pull together a couple of wonderful threads here, and I want to say Andrew Mitchell was brilliant to put you second, because your paper, your presentation addresses a lot of the questions raised by the first one. So you begin with the notion of the imagined community of a place that hardly had any kind of nation-state identity. And I'd like to ask you to think, along with Hannah Arendt, about the problem of statelessness. So here for an imagined community that is just, what is the project of constituting such a community is totally undermined and threatened by the presence of another people within. Is the nation, the natality notion that we all kind of share something. So as you were going through all those quotations, I was asking myself, why this outsized terror and loathing of the nomad? And it doesn't seem that it's about usury or capitalism per se, as you mentioned at the end, but it's something about the nomad. Is it about the nomad per se? Is it a kind of abjection? It doesn't seem to be abjection. It seems to be, I want to ask you psychoanalytically, and I know you do think that way, about what is the terror that the nomad presents to those Europeans who are trying to constitute nation states? Could it be that the terror is that we are all really, truly stateless, and it's just a complete fabrication and fiction, that there really is no home? So for Heidegger seems to be, as Peter Pruning was talking, worried that the Jew can destroy the home, but perhaps it's the other way around, that the Jew presents the Jew as they're being constituted, that there really is no home in the first place.
Well, again, I will agree with you completely, and I would say that abstractly one could say this in general, but it's even truer of the constitution of the German nation. Because remember that Heidegger is of that first generation of Germans. I mean, we really have to understand that before the 1870s, the notion of the German, and Lessing does this in the notion of the German theater, is an imagined community. Not just in Ben Anderson's sense, but in a real sense. You have 30-plus German states, and then I'm leaving out Austro-Hungarian Empire completely in this one, right? And so the people who talk about themselves as Germans, and that's why the Enlightenment in Germany, starting with Herder, is so fascinating. When they start to constitute the notion of Germanness, they're doing it unlike the French, right? With the existence of a nation state. And I would even argue, because post-Queen Anne, there has been this creation of the fiction of the Briton, but certainly by the end of the 18th century, or at least post-Walter Scott, the notion of the Britain exists as a nation state and as a myth, as an imagined community simultaneously. The Germans don't have that. And so they're constantly constituting themselves as German is against what? Against what? And if, in point of fact, these boundaries are infinitely malleable, and I mean infinitely malleable, every time one of these little principalities split, you've got new states, right? Every time there's a little war, you've got fewer states. Then the notion of rootedness is itself an illusion, and one has to say this over and over and over again, right? It is an illusion in Central Europe. By the way, it may be an illusion in human history, but it's certainly an illusion in Central Europe. And so the notion of being the nomad is what, in point of fact, is the experience. And, one of the things that one has to say is that we've spent a lot of time in history arguing against the notion of the German Sonderweg, the special, quality of Germanness. But there really is a special quality of Germanness when you start to look about the constitution of the nation state. So the answer is I would agree completely. In a world in which mobility is forced oftentimes, in which boundaries are always shifting, in which identity is performative in the 18th century sense of the word, not in the 20th century sense of the word, right? Because you don't know what citizenship you have from one month to the next oftentimes. Then the notion of what you're not becomes really important, and being rooted is really important. And that's not a question of Heidegger. That's a question of post-Enlightenment Central European thought, right? And if you want the roots for that, again, Herder has this, Kant has that. Yeah, thank you.
So unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more question before the break, but hopefully we can take those questions at the break and continue the discussion. So the next in line, you want to? Okay, great.
Throughout your presentation, I hear the notion that these Jews chose to be nomads. In other words, the notion is that Jews chose to lose the first temple. They had a city, they were not nomads. And as the result of losing the first temple and then the second temple, and the history shows, they became homeless, not by their choice. They were defeated. So the world, especially the European writers, are criticizing Jews to survive after defeat. So why this is so frightening to civilization, that the Jews, after being defeated, they survived, as you call it, nomad or galut or whatever you call it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, again, if you take a look, and there's been, in the late 20th century, a whole literature on the sort of Tanakh, the Bible, as a kind of a model for Jewish internalization of experience. And by the way, we're not, as I said, when I use the term Jews, I'm talking about stereotypical structures. But here I'm talking about sort of self-labeling. They're Jews, certainly, who were driven out by political exile. But like the Greeks, the Jews are throughout Europe and Asia, right? Like the Armenians, like the Turks, like the Romans, right? Because that notion of mobility is part and parcel of what human beings are. Now, what the motivation for mobility is, whether you're driven or attracted, that's a conversation you have. By the way, it can be both. It can be both. So that notion, which is what I'm trying to get in at my notion in the book on cosmopolitanism, is that by the 18th century, in a Europe that is beginning to consolidate into nation states, this question of being positive cosmopolitan, universal citizens, at home everywhere in the world, or negative cosmopolitan, by definition making pretend you're a German when in point of fact you're really not a German. When you're a nomad, meaning a good nomad, meaning people who create, right, the modern state, or a bad nomad, people who violate the tenets of the modern state, becomes part of an ideology, right? And to project it back in history, which, by the way, they do, that's why Weber writes Ancient Judaism, is in point of fact a fantasy about the past. That's why when I talk about, for example, Temple Judaism, I'm talking about 18th and 19th century constructions of Temple Judaism, right? And you have to really argue this, because when you start to talk about the Jews as if they're real in the world, then somebody's going to say at some point, what Jews are you talking about? And so what I'm interested in is both stereotypes that are generated by people who see themselves as Jewish or see themselves not as Jewish, right? But also how those stereotypes begin to define those other categories, like the Germans, same kind of a stereotype, or the French, right? Or, by the way, the Poles. So let me say that my comfort level drops off substantially when one gets further and further back in time. And I thank you for your attention.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University. Please visit us at emory.edu.